19 hours 30 all across this beautiful country that we call Guyana. And Guyana, it is time to enter room 592 where we unleash the truth. This evening at the helm of the program, Dr. Mahadeo along his loyal co-host, senior journalist of Kaiser News, Mr. Leonard Gildarie. And this evening, their guests, a pretty woman with a head of hair to rival that of every gentleman in this room, Miss Deborah, Misir, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Policy, U.S. Department of Labor, and Mr. Douglas Meurs, former political advisor and director for Somalia Office of the Secretary of Defense. Good evening, gentlemen and women.
Good evening, and thank you, Kevin Smith, and good evening to you, my co-host, and to our two guests tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, all across Guyana, the Caribbean, United States, UK, Canada, and let me acknowledge our viewers that are joining us from Brazil, Suriname, St. Kitts, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, Trinidad, and our small group but loyal followers in UK, of course, London there. How are you, ladies and gentlemen? Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. I have to call them out, Leonard, because they have been so loyal with us every day. And of course, as of this morning, yesterday, in fact, we learned that we have quite some following in BVI. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and a warm good evening to each and every one of you all across this beautiful world of ours, coming out here from Georgetown, Guyana. We bring you room 592, where we unleash the truth. And ladies and gentlemen, these past days have been one filled with turmoil, not just past days, these past 135 days has had us really take a deep dive into this Guyanese stock, into this thing we call Guyana, not as a country, but as a community, as a society. And ladies and gentlemen, we all know what would have transpired over the past couple of weeks. But we also know that we believe surely there is light at the end of the tunnel. It may seem very opaque at this stage, but we certainly know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And there is more so that light at the end of the tunnel because we see that our international associate, affiliates, friends, collaborators are all voicing their opinion on what is happening here in Guyana. I must remind you all that sanctions, this word sanctions, that seems to be so new to Guyana. Sanctions have been imposed in one form or another, imposed upon many, many, many countries, maybe all the countries over the world at one time or another in our history. And many times these countries and the persons may have been found wanting. So today's sanctions is a reality for Guyana. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, Guyana would have been supportive of or expressively in disagreement of sanctions imposed on other countries and other persons. For example, we were supportive of sanctions upon South Africa during the apartheid days. We were opposed to sanctions against Nicaragua and sanctions against Cuba. So Guyana has been part of an international community where we supported or opposed sanctions. It is not new to the politicians, ladies and gentlemen. But today's sanctions has become a reality to Guyana. What does it mean for our people? What does it mean for our country? At the cusp of being among the richest nations of the world, we have found that we have a deep deficit of right-minded politicians. Maybe we are not unique there. This is happening in other countries in the world. But to discuss this and more, particularly to look what does sanction mean to Guyana, what can Guyana look forward to, how can we emerge, which is the best thing to discuss, how can we emerge from the state we're in. We have here, ladies and gentlemen, two distinguished persons in room 592 tonight. And let me remind you, while our introductions are largely inadequate, I would still want to share with you just a few words about our distinguished lady and gentleman here tonight. And the gentleman is not Leonard Gildarie, it's Mr. Douglas Meurs. So ladies and gentlemen, let me take my pride and pleasure to introduce to you Miss Deborah Misir. Miss Deborah Misir is a partner at the New York-based Lally and Misir LLP. And they're civilized in civil and white-collar crimes, the trials and appellate litigation, and she provides advice on regulatory compliance, policy issues, and I don't want to bore you, but the list is admirable. As a lawyer, she would have also served as a professor, a law professor at the Touro Law School, the George Washington Law School, and she would have taught constitutional law, administrative law, appellate practice, and would have also directed the Veterans Clinic. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Misir is an ex-Marine.
What?
So we got to be careful. This fine, distinguished young lady is an ex-Marine, and she only got out of the service because injury cut short her service. She served as a counsel to the U.S. Foreign Terrorist Tracking Task Force, Counterterrorism and Intelligence Task Force that was created immediately in the wake of the 9/11 event that happened there to prevent future attacks. And she served in the administration of President George W. Bush as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor, Ethics Attorney at the White House Counsel's Office, and Chief of Staff of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Wouldn't you know, Ms. Misir started her career at the Department of Justice, where, as I said, she would have served in a number of different portfolios. Ladies and gentlemen, she graduated with an honors in political science from the University of Chicago, and she earned her law degree from the Minnesota Law School. I want to remind you, therefore, sharpen wit. Those of you who might have seen her interviews in various television fora in the US, sharpen wit, but also remind you, ladies and gentlemen, she is we are proud of her Guyanese roots. And for that, it's a distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight, Ms. Deborah Misir, in this room 592.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mahadeo. It's such a pleasure to be with you. It's really an honor.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, then the honor is mine to also introduce to you Mr. Douglas Meurs. I hope I pronounce it right. Mr. Douglas Meurs has worked in various capacities in many countries. He served as an economic counselor to the U.S. Embassy in Senegal, for example, overseeing the opening, interestingly, the opening of a West Africa trade hub office in Dakar. He served the United States at the UN in peace-building missions. He was a trade representative director for Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. That is in Washington, of course. A political and economic counselor to the U.S. mission to Somalia. And interestingly enough, ladies and gentlemen, in Somalia, Mr. Meurs worked overtly and covertly. These are my words. I know they can correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Meurs worked overtly and covertly with politicians, trade partners, and other stakeholders. Guess what? In advocating for a new constitutional government and for the peaceful formation of that entire region to get them going. He worked with USAID and other bodies to draft proposals for the first transitional initiative for the stabilization program in Somalia. And he also initiated and chaired working groups that saw Department of Defense's presence in Somalia to train, to equip the Somalia troops. So he has not just been an officer of the United States carrying out his mandate as an officer, he has also been instrumental in building the ground wherever he would have been attached to. And so he served as a deputy manager of the U.S. regional office in Iraq, overseeing operations that examined political and security developments there and advocating for positive solutions on the matters there. And he continued to provide policy management and recommendations to the Secretary of Defense on matters relating to security, counterterrorism activities, etc. So, ladies and gentlemen, in my own view, this gentleman works, as I said, not just to serve his own country, but he has distinguished himself that in serving his own country, he's also going to serve those countries into which he has been provided the honor of serving his own country. So, Mr. Meurs and Ms. Misir has joined us here tonight, and Mr. Douglas Meurs, I want to tell you, welcome, sir, on behalf of Guyana to room 592. You're muted, sir. Your mic is muted. There you go.
Dog, it's a great pleasure to be with you, but you forgot to mention the most important fact. My first overseas diplomatic posting was to Guyana.
Oh,
You didn't know that, did you?
I actually did not know that. Great, great. So we'll certainly get into that, and thank you for that correction. So, Mr. Meurs, you are no stranger to Guyana. Miss Misir, you are no stranger to Guyana, and therefore, you would have had Guyana in your DNA, being your first diplomatic mission here and being your birth, your country of birth. Ladies and gentlemen, it is therefore our distinct pleasure to welcome these two persons to our room 592. And I want to get the ball rolling by coming to you first, Miss Misir. Give us a little word, give us a little take on what you are up to nowadays, especially in terms of how you're looking at the situation in Guyana. Of course, your heart probably bleeds sometimes when you look at how a country that can progress has not been progressing.
Absolutely, Mr. Mahadeo. And I come to you tonight and to everyone who's listening and to the people of Guyana and say, I'm an American, but I love Guyana. My parents are both from Guyana. I've spent a lot of time there. My husband and I have spent time there as adults as well. And I bring you words of strength, hope, and courage. I know that Guyana will get through this. The situation we have right now cannot stand. It's intolerable. And as Ambassador Lynch and Secretary Pompeo have rightly said, caretaker President, Mr. Granger, respectfully, it's time to leave. It's time to respect the will of the people, respect the will of the voters, and let's move forward together constructively.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ms. Misir. And Mr. Douglas Meurs, sir, over to you.
Well, I've certainly drank the black water and eaten the lava. And,
he knows, Yogi knows.
Sorry.
So I echo Deborah in wishing an end to this unfortunate situation and for the properly elected government to duly take its place as soon as possible.
Great. And if you don't mind me asking you this, sir, before we get into our substantive discussion, in your posting to Guyana, then, what stands out in your mind about Guyana going to those years? What stands out to you?
Well, I've been back quite a few times in the last 2 years, and Guyana is a hotter, more crowded, but also more vibrant and more diverse place than it was those 30 years ago. And it's remarkable to see how Guyana is in the process of, I think, turning itself so it faces South America as well as the Caribbean and the United States and the UK. And I think it's a great transformation of the country to come, along with, of course, the remarkable, economic growth that we see from oil. But it'll be a cultural and a social revolution as well for Guyana. And I think this political chaos is just keeping people from facing the many problems that Guyana needs to deal with to adjust itself to these changes.
Yeah, and did you really drink the black water and eat the organic stuff?
The man knows about it. Who are you asking him for?
Well, I have to ask. I can't let Mr. Douglas, Mr. Meurs just tell us these things, right? But anyway, jokes aside, I want to get to our substantive discussion, if you don't mind. And lady and sir and lady, I want to ask you this. Now, the Guyana government, through President Granger, on May the 19th, would have said, President Granger said, show me the evidence that I'm involved in something before you impose sanctions. And interestingly, the U.S. ambassador today was asked the same question. Are you not putting the cart before the horse? Why are you imposing sanctions when the government said it didn't do anything wrong? Ms. Misir, you want to go first?
Sure. I disagree with that assessment. Whoever asked the ambassador that question, as I said, I think the sanctions are warranted. There was an election several months ago at this point. There's been delays. There's been really frivolous litigation brought by the caretaker government to impede and stop the proper transfer of power. And when you have the CCJ, which is the highest court in Guyana, Guyanese government officials are obliged to follow the orders of the CCJ. When you have the CCJ come out and say, this is just ridiculous in essence, and direct what GCOM and what the Honorable Claudette Singh has to do, absolutely the sanctions are warranted. And Mr. Mahadeo, you rightfully pointed out at the beginning of the program that Guyana has supported sanctions on rogue nations such as South Africa. We don't need Guyana to become a rogue nation, but we're right at that tipping point. And I would say to the caretaker government and to the caretaker president, Mr. Granger, respectfully, do you want to be remembered as a statesman? Or do you want to be remembered as a rogue? You have that choice. You still have the ability to be remembered respectfully and with honor in history. And he has to do the right thing.
Thank you for that. Mr. Meurs, I just want to ask you something. Allow me to explain the backdrop. The U.S. ambassador, in company of other ambassadors and high commissioners, would have been escorted out of the GCOM building at one time. Well, they walked out. They walked out after seeing what was happening there. And that didn't go down well on a lot of persons. But, sir, the language of diplomacy seems to not have been understood by politicians. Now, you have worked in a number of countries. And the language of diplomacy, how better can it be expressed then to recalcitrants, to politicians who refuse? And please allow me 30 seconds to explain this. So, 2 weeks ago, a week ago, U.S. Secretary of State said, I have instructed my department to look into those people. Yesterday, Secretary of State said, visa revocations are here and it is implemented. Sir, has something been wrong with the language, the diplomatic language, that it has not been reaching through? You're muted, sir.
Let me say this, Mr. Mahadeo, and I don't speak for Ambassador Lynch, and I don't speak for the embassy. I hadn't had contact with either. But I've seen sanctions play out in many countries. And what's remarkable to me is the speed in which these sanctions have been announced and the coordinated manner that they've been carried out with Canada in the UK. And what President Granger and the cabal behind him need to know is that this reflects the world's consensus. CARICOM, OAS, the United States, Canada, the UK, Brazil, all of them are rejecting the APNU's pseudo-legalistic tactics of hiding behind a dubious interpretation of the Constitution and endlessly using the courts to stay in power and to avoid recognizing the results of a free and fair election and an efficient and well-executed recount of the votes. The world has concluded that 4 months later, it's time for the new government to take place and for the will of the Guyanese people to be recognized. And this is not unilateral sanctions by the United States. It's not a symbolic act. A lot of effort has gone into a coordinated levy of sanctions by many different countries. And it's going to be quickly followed, I think, by sanctions from the EU and from Guyana's neighbors. And Granger needs to understand that the United States is not acting alone. It's not an isolated gesture that can be shrugged off.
Thank you. And I want to come back at you, Mr. Meurs. And I'm sorry to bring this up at this stage, but the Guyana government, their spokesperson would have been on state television today and would have accused the United States of wanting to take such punitive measures because of a race card. Somehow, all of a sudden, people have realized that Mr. Granger is of a particular race. You have worked in Africa, you have worked in Asia, you have worked all over Mr. Meurs. How do you respond from a diplomatic perspective to such accusations?
It's ridiculous. We only recognize two colors, green of democracy and red for authoritarian and undemocratic regimes. And in this case, all of Guyana is green. And this is an attempt to force the government to recognize the will of all Guyanese people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Misir, you are a constitutional lawyer. You would have thought, United States Constitution. The attempts that would have been made to bypass the Constitution would have started since President Granger unilaterally appointed as chairman of GCOM. Ma'am, what would you have thought when you were seeing the travesty that would have been imposed upon Guyana to go to the CCJ to determine that 33 was a greater part of 65 because the government lost that confidence motion?
Respectfully, Mr. Mahadeo, how embarrassing. We know how to count in Guyana. I went to school for a couple years in Guyana, and we have brilliant folks in Guyana. We have sensible, and if Mr. Granger thinks that the U.S. policy would change if we had a change in, for example, our administration, I think he'll be sadly mistaken, because any administration of the United States will support democracy, will support the will of the people, will respect the vote.
Thank you. And I want to write back at you, Ms. Misir. There is a notion that has been discussed in the same platform 2 nights ago, where one of our guests put forward a theory that whether, given what Granger and his team would have done, whether the chairman declares the opposite side as having won these elections, that Mr. Granger may refuse to step down because too much has happened, too much water has gone under the bridge. What then would be the nature of sanctions? And immediately after you, Mr. Meurs, if you could answer the same question.
That's a great question, Mr. Mahadeo. And the process really started today with the announcement by Ambassador Lynch. But there's a number of things. There's a number of tools at the disposal of the U.S. government. There's a number of laws, starting with the immigration law, of course. And it's important for Guyanese because Guyana is so close to the United States. There are over 1 million Guyanese Americans in the United States. I would venture to guess that most of the officials in the caretaker government have relatives living in New York, Florida, Maryland, all over the United States, who are U.S. citizens and who are green card holders. They themselves, the officials, many of them are U.S. citizens or green card holders, or certainly want to avail themselves of B1 visitor visas. So right from the get-go, that access or entry into the United States is now going to be a problem for them, and potentially stretch out to their family members, their immediate family members, who may be working with them to, again, frustrate the will of the Guyanese people and frustrate the will of this election. Their immediate relatives are going to find themselves also subject to sanctions. Immigration is one area. Another area is financial. Of course, we have the FATCA. There are provisions in the FATCA that can be utilized against officials. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which would essentially expose, again, the relatives and the officials. Anyone who is a U.S. citizen or a green card holder and is engaged in corrupt acts could potentially be liable, criminally liable under that act. There are other diverse acts, the Foreign Tort Claims Act, If a US citizen is harmed by the actions of the US government, and again, there are a lot of US citizens in Guyana, they have standing to bring private suits in the United States against those officials and against their family members. And the list goes on and on. There's the anti-money laundering statutes. There's the no-fly list. There's the terrorist list. It depends on how tough the US government wants to be. And the message from President Trump and the message from Secretary of State Pompeo has been unambiguous. You lost the election. At this point, you're engaged in the actions of a rogue government. It's time to go.
Thank you. Mr. Meurs, on that same point, if you don't mind, sir, your role as an economic advisor to the U.S. State Department and so forth is well noted. Sir, we believe here that you guys, when I say you guys, I mean the world at large, would have already imposed sanctions in a way. We can't have access to our own oil monies because the bank over there would have said we can only release it to a legitimate government. Your thoughts, sir? Please unmute. Please unmute.
I'll master Zoom yet. Sanctions invariably begin with targeting individuals. And there's two reasons for that. One is you want to inflict as much pain as possible at as early a stage as possible on the ringleaders. And the second is you want to avoid pain to the common citizen. And so sanctions start with the very top, and then they'll go down through the ranks of that organization. And in Venezuela, the individual sanctions are now targeting, as of this month, 718 individuals in 150 entities. And it's not just the inability to travel to the United States that makes life unpleasant for them. It's the fact that their assets get frozen, that they find it difficult to do business, that banks will not work with them. And believe me, they do not want the scrutiny of the US, the UK, the Canadian government, and any other international organization out there looking at their private affairs, because they will now be under a financial microscope. The Office of the Financial Asset Controls, OFAC in Treasury, FinCEN, the Financial Intelligence Organization of the US, the Sanctions Office in the State Department, all of them will be combing through these people's affairs, looking for evidence of illegal assets that have been moved overseas, looking for ties to narco trafficking, looking for their illegal and corrupt acts in the embezzlement of resources. You do not want that scrutiny, and you do not want your bad acts to come to light. So sanctions begin with targeting those individuals, but there's a lot of other places that sanctions can ultimately go to if targeting those individuals doesn't work. Foreign assistance can be cut. Guyana received $4.7 million in developmental aid last year from the United States. I'm sure Canada and the UK are looking at their programs as well. There can be export-import limitations. There can be asset freezes. There can be increase in tariffs on products going from Guyana to the United States. I note that the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act, the CBTPA, is up for renewal in September. It's possible that Guyana could be written out of the trade benefits from that act. We can withdraw ambassadors. The United States can place a negative vote when Guyana wants to access capital from international financial institutions such as the World Bank. You can even cancel airlinks. You can eliminate military training. You can stop Guyana's ability to do credit financing. And you can pretty much turn off the spigot of foreign investment that will flow to Guyana, which is particularly troublesome because of the intention that's been paid to Guyana as it becomes sort of a mini oil power. So begins with individuals. Those individuals do not want what's going to come down on them. And there's a long menu that the United States and other countries can choose from there. And President Granger really needs to be aware of this.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Ms. Misir, you would have mentioned certain chapters and sections of various laws. Here is a question that is of interest to Guyanese. And I'm sure Mr. Meurs would have experienced this in the countries he worked as well. Now, a lot of the false narratives, a lot of the propping up of what is going on here is believed to have been caused, engineered, and supported by people who live, Guyanese, but they are US citizens. They live over there with you guys. Now, this mischief, therefore, being done upon this country, promulgating and promoting an illegal government, takes place every day in front of our eyes. They have had congressmen, some of them, on their Facebook page interviewing and so forth. So, Ms. Misir, whether Guyana and people who are US dual citizens do this, and how then can you tell Guyanese, well, we're going to impose sanction on the people locally?
That's a great question, Mr. Mahadeo. And again, I'm not part of the US government right now. I'm in private practice, but I would venture to guess that the US government is well aware of those individuals and is monitoring what they are doing. And they are putting themselves in legal jeopardy. The panoply of sanctions that Mr. Meurs articulated just now, it can be even more severe for a US citizen. They don't want to be indicted and hauled into federal court on wire fraud, on conspiracy to commit these acts, and they are liable for them. And it's very easy to prove it in federal court. I would remind our viewers that Manuel Noriega and Dino Burdase both ended up in US prisons. So the reach of the United States is far, it is strong, and it is righteous in wanting to ensure that the will of the Guyanese people is respected.
And Mr. Meurs, the same question to you, sir, because in working in the West Africa region, I'm sure you would have had scenarios where persons from within the US would have been supporting the instability in areas you work. How would you have dealt with it, sir? Please unmute. Still not unmuted. Yes.
The recalcitrance of Granger and his cabal is undoubtedly due to the fact that they have been plundering Guyana's coffers, and they've been moving money and assets and whatever they can sell overseas. So no doubt there's a panoply of illegal financial transactions that have taken place. If US citizens are involved in that embezzlement or in moving those assets or in concealing these criminal acts, no doubt that they're liable for criminal prosecution, for tax violations, for wire fraud, and for many other crimes in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Misir, I want to come back to you again on this, a follow-up to the same point, because the script to rig these elections would have probably been written years ago. And I'm sure, Mr. Meurs, in your work that you had done, Ms. Misir, in your work you would have probably been aware of some of the things. But the script for rigging these elections seems to have been well crafted. And 4 weeks to 5 weeks ago, it was no other than a US-based Guyanese-born person that said, burn the ballot boxes. I think he meant it figuratively, but the call was there that, only certain votes must be counted. And it is felt by Guyanese that had early enough action been taken, a lot of this stuff would have stopped. It's 136 days now from the elections. Is there any way that early action could have been taken?
You know, who knows? Hindsight is 20/20 always, right? And I think the US government has tried to be respectful of the Guyanese people, respectful of their sovereignty, and has tried to facilitate and mediate a peaceful transfer of power. Understanding that Mr. Granger, again, had a reputation as a statesman, has been in government for decades. He should know better.
Right.
And there are many good people in the PNC.
Yeah.
There are many lawyers. I've had the privilege of getting to know some of them because my father, before he retired, practiced law in Guyana, and he got to know many of them. And they are good men and women.
Yeah.
How can they tolerate this as lawyers, as barristers, as members of the bar? How can they tolerate this flagrant untruth and lying? And if I may add, Mr. Mahadeo, the attacks on Mrs. Claudette Singh are reprehensible. They are completely out of line. There should be no threat to any government official. There should be no intimidation of a government official. And I've been advised that Mrs. Singh faced assault months ago. And if that is the case, that is so outrageous and beyond the pale.
Yes.
And whoever directed or authorized that must be brought to justice and should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves.
Thank you. And if I can ask you another follow-up from an earlier question, Ms. Misir. Earlier, both you and Mr. Meurs would have said that, and the US ambassador said that today, that you do not usually disclose to the public who are the names of the persons that are sanctioned. I think you hinted at that. If you are going to name and shame, why not name and shame? Why not? Isn't that a penalty as well?
Well, there may be, and I think Mr. Meurs can probably speak to this, coming from the State Department. There may be a strategic reason why that is the case. Perhaps they don't want everyone to know everyone who's on the list. Perhaps that list is growing. Perhaps a person can be taken off the list if they choose to cooperate and if they choose to do the right thing. And if they did in fact choose to do the right thing and cooperate, there's no reason to damage their reputation, if you will, in advance of that. So there can be some very sound reasons for not revealing those names. I think we all know who's on those lists based on who the bad actors. Everyone knows who the bad actors are here. Guyana is not a big country. Everyone knows each other. There's nowhere to hide.
Indeed. Mr. Meurs?
Individual sanctions are most effective when you don't know if you're on the list, because the number of people affected by that is going to be greater than if there was a list in a finite number of names. In addition, you don't need, a sort of adjudication process where people, challenge, why their name is on the list or ask why someone is on the list and someone isn't. It's best to keep things simple, and it's best to keep things unknown so the maximum number of people wonder or perhaps change their behavior in order to avoid being designated on the list.
Right. And Mr. Meurs, today some of the Guyanese Facebook lawyers would have taken pains to post the section and act of your laws that says you cannot remove somebody's visa, you have to give them a right to be heard. Is there any water to that, sir? Is there any truth to that? Is it a misrepresentation?
No, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is there is not. This isn't something that can be challenged in court. A visa is a privilege that's granted you. It's a privilege that can be taken away.
Thank you. Ms. Misir, that's right up your...
There's a doctrine called consular non-reviewability, okay? It's sort of a cornerstone of our immigration law. And what that means is the actions of Ambassador Lynch the actions of consular officers in Guyana cannot be challenged or cannot be reviewed in any U.S. court. Moreover, as someone who has practiced for many years on both sides, government and private, in the immigration area, I would caution anyone who thinks they're going to challenge this with the warning that you're not likely to prevail. You're not likely to prevail. The U.S. government has broad authority to limit or restrict the entry of aliens, meaning people who are not U.S. citizens, into the United States. And it has that authority also with respect to green card holders. So you're facing a long haul if you think you're going to fight this in court. You're not going to be successful, in my view.
And thank you very much for that, Yog. I must butt in there. I want to apologize for disappearing for a little while, and good evening to our two esteemed guests at the moment. Yog, I must tell the people of Guyana something. I want to apologize. We got a break there. For the third time in as many nights, we would have been caught up, sure. Too much coincidence at this point in time. But so we are investigating it on behalf of management. Our apologies. But three times in as much many nights we are investigating.
It's not going to happen again.
No. But it is what it is. But I want to ask the two guests a question that would have come in from our people that are listening. And that is, if Guyanese, while the U.S. Embassy today says that they don't want to name the person, they can't, is there anything that anybody in the United States could do, as a citizen maybe, that could request such information? Is there anything that could happen like that?
And any one of you can take that. I'm not sure who can.
Mr. Meurs, would you like to go?
It's an uneducated. It's uneducated on my part because I've never worked in that office. But I think pretty much the most you could do is submit a Freedom of Information request to try to get some of the documentation behind being designated for sanctions. And I don't think you'll succeed. Oftentimes, the entire process is classified, and that information is not easily releasable, and it's not a judicial process. There is no court to appeal to. So you can try, but I don't think you'd get very far.
Right.
Thank you.
Mr. I want to follow up with quoting Ambassador Lynch, who said today that part of the United States consideration, and you are right, sir, she did mention twice that when we speak United States imposing sanctions, it is not just the U.S. as a country, but the OAS and the 130 countries around the world. And so, sir, she said today that the United States is concerned for serious adverse foreign policy consequences, serious adverse foreign policy consequences that might be there if these persons are allowed to flout the laws of Guyana and still have access to the U.S. and other places. If you don't mind, you can walk us through that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think these serious political consequences are having another anti-democratic regime join Venezuela in South America. And as Ms. Misir said earlier, it would be terrible for Guyana to be lumped in with the countries that are under sanctions now. You don't want to be associated on the same page with Venezuela and Syria in North Korea. And you are under sanctions for a reason. You have engaged in anti-democratic acts. You have likely embezzled the financial resources of your country, and you've otherwise thwarted the will of the people. For all of those reasons, you are not the upstanding individual to whom a visa could be given. It's a moral argument as much as it is a legal one.
Correct. And sir, if you don't mind, let us say that a sanction of individual sanction is imposed on Yog Mahadeo. is there also not something hidden there? Because unless you reveal that yoga is sanctioned, you can go and still enter into all kinds of contracts and all kinds of things that might be inimical to my country people.
You could, but there's the concept of political risk. When someone that you're trying to do business with,
Yes.
particularly a large corporation in the United States or elsewhere, is aware that there's a strong possibility that your name is on such a list for the acts you've committed, they probably will not do business with you.
Great. And thank you for bringing it up, because I didn't want to say it in my own words, but am I right to then conclude, sir, that by the United States or any country announcing that persons in Guyana have been slapped with sanctions, it then advertises that, okay, don't do business, don't do business there. Am I right to say that, sir?
You said that very clearly and succinctly.
Thank you. Ms. Misir, I want to come back to a little bit of the legal point. You know, the Granger government has, as of yesterday, insisted that it is not to be blamed for creating this 136 days delays. It is saying that it is private citizens who are taking these actions to court, and it cannot interfere with these actions at the court.
Right.
So it stands sanctimonious and sacrosanct. Your comment, ma'am.
Well, you know, it sounds like, you know, everyone knows what's happened. Everyone with a working brain knows what's happened. And I don't know who that spokesperson thinks that they're fooling, if you will. Let me be, you know, just direct to the point. That's kind of nonsensical. It's directly been the actions of the caretaker government that have led to this delay. There is no question about it. The CCJ came right out and said it. That is why all the governments, the United States, the United Kingdom, the OAS, CARICOM, that is why they have spoken with one voice, because they are quite aware of what the caretaker government, what Mr. Granger has done. And again, I urge the good people within the PNC, and I urge the good people within the caretaker government to walk away from this, because it is not going to go well, and you're on the wrong side of history.
Indeed. Well said. Well said. If you don't mind, Mr. Douglas Meurs, one of our commentators, Mr. Peter Wickham, who is a well-known political scientist in the Caribbean, he opined that what needs to happen is that some independent broker, let's just say the United States, for example, should probably start working behind the scenes to bring the actors to the table. In other words, he is saying that because there is the fear of sanctions and other penalties, they will not want to give up at all. They're going to hold up and hold up this process forever. And so he has proposed amnesty, that, okay, we're not going to give you a jail time. We're not going to give you this. We're not going to do that if you can let go of power. Mr. Meurs, is that a likelihood, sir? And is it something that it's probably too far gone and it's not accommodative now?
That's quite speculative in hypothetical. I think the attention of the world is focused on two simple acts. There were free and fair elections, and there was a reliable and well-executed recount. Full stop. The results of those two acts need to be implemented. Nobody sees this as a delicate political negotiation or as a complex problem that requires a third-party mediator. It's simply the long overdue recognition of an election that occurred on schedule, and the new government should be taking power. It's up to the Guyanese people in the end to decide if there needs to be a process of reconciliation or if there should be an amnesty for acts. That's probably not for the outside world to decide. And I have no doubt that there's any number of mediators who would be available if the Guyanese people chose to come to that point and decided that they wanted an outside advisor. But I can't imagine that the United States or anybody else would try to impose that.
Yes.
Thank you.
And if I may, Yog, here, this is one of the issues that were raised. So the actions by the U.S. State Department is directed at people in Guyana, but there are others who are living overseas, right in the U.S., that may be parties to the coalition, and others here who are agitating, who are saying things, who are on Facebook, who on social media, making a lot of comments. Is there anything that the U.S. that maybe that they could do, because these people are standing contrary to what the U.S. State Department, what the U.S. government is saying? Is there anything that
Well,
could be done to them?
well, I must say, Leonard, you would owe whatever it is you could owe. Maybe a Guyanese gift to both Ms. Misir and Mr. Meurs, because they did deal with that way.
My apologies when I was off. Okay, good, great.
So again, I mean, I just want to move on. Ms. Misir and Mr. Meurs, I am sure you would have been asked this from other countries. A lot of the government operatives have said, what moral ground does the USA have to preach on Guyana about its elections when the US itself has a lot of complaints and saying Russian meddling and this and that and the other? How do you respond to that accusation? Ma'am first and then sir.
Well, first of all, in the United States, we have had peaceful transfer of power for 200 years, more than 200 years. Okay. And when our Supreme Court speaks, the political parties and the administrations have to listen. In the case of Guyana, the CCJ has spoken. And the caretaker government refuses to abide by the rule of law. That's clear as day to anyone.
Thank you. Mr. Meurs?
Well, this argument has come up over and over again in the last 50 years. I think that there's been over 200 examples of sanctions being levied by the United States, and probably worldwide, the number of sanctions imposed has been in the thousands. And people always say, well, if your house is not perfectly in order, how could you do that to us? And the answer is, the world isn't always consistent. Elections in the US are free and fair for the most part. Sometimes they're not well organized, but they're still free and fair. And the United States will continue to impose sanctions, and that is a fact of life. And if you want to be a member of a democratic community like CARICOM or the Organization of American States, you need to meet those standards. And if you do not, other countries that are members of those organizations or any other international alliance of states will censure you.
Thank you. And just going back to this thing about who are we protecting and who are we penalizing, ladies and gentlemen, I want to just pause for a couple seconds to acknowledge all of you joining us by radio all across the country as well, Pomeroon, Corriverton, Blackbush Polder, wherever you're joining us from. Once again, it's good to have you here in this interesting discussion. Ms. Misir, one of our attorneys, in fact, former Attorney General, Mr. Anil Nandlal, said the following. He said, Guyanese, sanctions are for the protection of Guyana and Guyanese against those who wish to destroy our own country. Your comment, ma'am.
Sounds accurate in this situation, right?
Yeah.
Let's not forget, and you know better, Mr. Mahadeo, than I ever could, but ordinary Guyanese are suffering. There's a lot of economic deprivation. Mm-hmm. And people are holding out hope for the new beginning that this government can bring. They're holding out hope, and in the meantime, they're suffering because of the actions of the caretaker government. So these sanctions are designed to force Mr. Granger and the caretaker government to abide by the will of the people. That's all.
Thank you. And Mr. Meurs, just to set the record right, because you mentioned you hinted something like this before. ladies and gentlemen, the sanction is not imposed upon a person in terms of taking a side. The U.S. ambassador is quite clear of that. They really don't care who forms the government as long as it is the party that won the will of the electorate. But Mr. Meurs, the question I have for you then, or for your comment, not a question, for your comment, please. In 2015, it was the U.S. that would have been part of the forces that Guyanese saw, some Guyanese saw that was against the PPP and supportive of the PNC, and intervened to get them into office, and intervene, I mean, in a positive way, enforcing and ensuring law is followed. So, sir, how do you feel when you are now told that you could have only intervened on one side of the coin and not allowed to intervene again?
Well, I think the United States position, as well as the position of every other country that's announced sanctions against Guyana, as well as CARICOM in OAS, is in support of the process. And the process is free and fair elections, regardless of what the outcome is or who the victor might be. Mm-hmm. And I want to go back to the question you asked earlier about what the impact is on the Guyanese people.
Yes.
I mean, clearly the first impact is their will has not been recognized. But the second impact, and I think this is one that President Granger needs to pay particularly close attention to, is Guyana is truly the land of opportunity. Between its rich natural resources, between the oil revenues coming in, between the attention that Guyana has received over the last 2 years as oil was announced and as elections were carried out, there are any number of rich commercial and industrial and natural resource extraction opportunities that were open to this country that are now in the process of being closed. And if you think you should remain in power in order to take advantage of them, you're sadly mistaken, because companies will stay away, capital will not come to Guyana. Those companies that do will find it difficult to do business there, and capital will flow to other countries that are free and democratic and where the political risk is lower. And that's a tragedy for the Guyanese people.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry, you hinted at this before, but if you don't mind expounding, you did say that following the heels of this, the UK, European Union, and so forth may as well come and take action?
I believe so. I understand that the EU is considering its own sanctions, but typically when the United States and other countries announce an initial round of sanctions, there are countries that pay close attention to the announcement, consult with the United States or with the UK or with the United Nations, whomever, in order to put together their own list of individuals to be sanctioned. And I've seen that happen in many other countries.
Correct. Sorry, Ms. Misir, there is another issue that is more or less race related, and there a handful. Well, let me not say handful, but a number of Guyanese are quite passionate about their belief that they cannot allow the PPPC, who won these elections, to come into power because of their ethnic insecurities. From your previous job holdings, and Mr. Meurs, from your current holdings and so forth, how do you then speak across that insecurity?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Mr. Mahadeo, in terms of the sentiment of many Guyanese people. And I say Guyanese people have to have courage. They have to have courage to forge a new path. And they have to be willing to take the chance. Other countries have done it. I give the example of Ireland, where there was such deep hostility and suspicion for generations, for centuries, between Protestants and Catholics. And people were able to push past the fear, embrace hope, and move forward in a courageous fashion. And this is the moment, this is the time, Guyanese people have to say, I'm willing to take that chance. And I'm not 100% familiar with all the politics of Guyana, but I do know that the PPP has Dr. Irfan Ali as the president-elect. He's obviously Indian and he's Muslim. The chairman of the party, former President Bharat Jagdeo, is Indian and comes from a Hindu family. And the prime minister-elect is Mark Phillips, who's Afro-Guyanese and Christian. And I know there are people of many different ethnicities in the PPP. Likewise, there have been people of different ethnicities in the PNC. It's time for a new generation to step up and say, we don't want this. We're not doing things the old way. We're going to be strong, we're going to be brave, and we're going to embrace a future multi-ethnic Guyana where opportunities are available to all. And when the PPP, when the winners of this election come to power, that will have to be an important policy objective for them to seek to achieve.
Thank you. Mr. Meurs, the people of Guyana, earlier Ms. Misir would have mentioned the people of Guyana in this time of COVID-19, for example, a lot of people are suffering. And a lot of people feel that, there is an incumbent that holds on to power over 136 days while they're struggling to find a meal for children and so forth. Sir, from a Guyanese non-political perspective, sir, what do we say to the Guyanese people? Because the United States imposing sanctions upon the top leadership to the grassroots may not mean anything to them if the government doesn't give up. What do we say to them, sir?
Well, I think you say two things. The first is sanctions will initially target individuals, those at the head of their organization that refuse to recognize the will of the Guyanese people and carry out the results of the election. And sanctions are not targeted at the average person on the street. The second thing is, despite sanctions, assistance from the United States, and I would imagine from the other countries that have imposed sanctions to Guyana for coronavirus will likely continue and probably increase.
Yes. Thank you for that, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to share this with you and seek the opinion of our guests. Today, Sir Ronald Saunders would have documented, he wrote an article, in part he said the following. He said the Permanent Council of all 33 member states of the OAS will meet on July 21 to consider the situation in Guyana. The matter will not end there, particularly as 3 of the largest OAS members, Brazil, Canada, and the US, have now announced strong positions publicly. Mr. Meurs, in terms of Brazil, as you would have known, sir, Brazil would have made a statement 2 days ago about Guyana and its never-ending elections. Do you see this being the agenda of this OAS meeting soon, sir? Because is it that priority now?
Well, I think it is. I think the swiftness that sanctions were imposed and the fact that they were imposed in a coordinated manner means that this is being taken seriously by all countries that have an interest in Guyana. Brazil right now is, let's sort of charitably say, has the tendency to like authoritarian governments in the fact that despite this tendency, they have pretty rapidly come out just behind the United States, Canada, and UK in announcing their intention to impose sanctions, is a sign that the acts of the Granger government in thwarting the election are just too blatant to be ignored and passed over. And Brazil will be part of the international community. And if you're getting this treatment from them and from the Trump administration, imagine what will happen with the Biden administration in the future should Joe Biden become president in the United States.
Very well said, sir. Thank you. And Ms. Misir, in terms of your Guyanese roots, ma'am, just changing topic a little bit. Do you envisage probably coming back to Guyana one day?
Oh, I would love to. I love Guyana. My husband is not Guyanese, but we got married in Guyana 10 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Because he loved Guyana. We had our wedding in Guyana. And as I said, I spent some time there as a kid. And my father, when he retired here from his job here in the United States, he went back to Guyana to practice because he loved Guyana. There are so many Guyanese Americans, Guyanese who live in the United Kingdom, Canada, who, while loyal and loving and blessed to be in their countries where they live, still have that special feeling for Guyana. And they're on edge too. Their hearts are beating too. They want the best for Guyana too. We all do. And that means for Guyanese of all backgrounds. Correct. So I would love to come back to Guyana, and I would love to meet you in person.
Great. Same here. And one of the reasons I asked you, of course, is going back to what Mr. Meurs said. Guyana has a lot of, you said it yourself as well, Guyana has a lot of potential. And one of the things we certainly know, what caught my interest was your being a professor in terms of teaching law, of the various types of law. And Guyana has a lot of potential for education tourism in terms of bringing in foreign students to study at our university. And certainly law would be one of the things that a lot of people are interested in seeing that the University of Guyana take to its highest level. So thank you for that. And, we're looking forward to what the future can give to us. In wrapping up our discussions here, Leonard, I don't know if you have any other burning questions for our guests. I don't necessarily want to keep it going.
No, yes, thank you very much, Yoga. We have some questions here from our listeners and lookers, and they're asking. There've been talks about having boots on the ground, maybe asking for international help. So I don't know if I missed it a little early when I was out for a little while, but I want to ask maybe our two esteemed guests, what are the possibility of that, and could we probably walk through that? How do you arrive at that, something like that?
Yes, I mean, Ms. Misir, I could probably direct it at you first, and Mr. Meurs, you second, because the issue here is whether there is a contemplation of a boots on the ground kind of approach, where if this thing were to prolong any further.
I thought just a little addition to that. Some people have been calling for, and these are viewers, listeners, for maybe UN troops or something. I'm not sure how that works, and I hope to God we never come to that day. But it's good to have a conversation like this.
Mr. Mahadeo and Mr. Leonard, I share that feeling. I hope to God that doesn't happen either, because Guyana has historically been a nonviolent, peaceful place, despite the political conflict the country has endured for many decades. It's generally been peaceful, and there's been very little bloodshed, and it should not come to that. The Guyanese army is relatively small, and it's a professional army. It's not Venezuela. It's not under the thumb of a Mr. Maduro. It's not ready to spill the blood of its fellow Guyanese citizens. So I would expect the Guyanese military and their senior officers to conduct themselves to the highest standards to which they've been taught, and in the finest tradition of the Guyanese army, remain apolitical and remain committed to democracy and respect for the fellow Guyanese citizens. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine that the learned people in the PNC leadership want such a scenario. And again, great efforts are being made to show them, again, they have a choice. They can be statesmen, or they can be pariahs and rogues and remembered disfavorably in history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And Mr. Meurs, indeed, Mr. Leonard's question is well pointed, and I want to refer it to you because, persons from within the current party structure of the incumbent would have said that they wanted they're calling on the president to declare a state of emergency. In other words, to take power regardless of what is the declaration. Sir, in your mind then, I mean, I hope it's not an inappropriate question. Doesn't that place an army, doesn't that place the security forces, the police, under terrible, terrible position? I mean, On one hand, the president is the commander-in-chief, and on the other hand, if he stays in power, then what happens? Kindly unmute.
I think today the scenario of foreign intervention, foreign military intervention in Guyana is virtually impossible to foresee. Guyana has always, by and large, solved its problems peacefully and found its way through political crises without widespread blood in the streets or civil disorder. However, there are similar countries that were similarly peaceful and ended up on a long, slippery slope down to the point of civil war, the country falling apart, and the foreign community forced to intervene simply to save the lives of mass numbers of civilians. And that has happened in the past. It will happen in the future. Pray God that that does not happen to Guyana.
Thank you, sir. And as we are going to come to wrapping up our program time, Ms. Misir, I would want to ask you for your, I wouldn't say parting shot, your parting words to the Guyanese politicians and on both sides of the divide, because on one hand, you would want that the PPP would continue to influence their supporters to remain peaceful and calm. And on the other side, your words, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mahadeo. First of all, thank you so much. It's been such an honor and pleasure to speak with you, Mr. Leonard, and Mr. Meurs tonight. And I've learned a lot from speaking to all of you. I end sort of where I began, which is have hope, have courage, and have strength. It is a fundamental human right for the Guyanese people's vote to be respected. It must be respected, and come what may, it will be respected. I urge the Guyanese people to have the courage to move forward with strength and forge a new beginning, and recognize that the diaspora, the Guyanese diaspora around the world, is fully supportive of them, and that in important countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, CARICOM also recognize what is just and fair. And again, I say to the caretaker government and to the caretaker president, please do the right thing. Step aside. It's time for a new government. Be part of a new Guyana. Don't become a pariah to the entire world community. And with that, God bless.
Thank you so much, Ms. Deborah, Misir. Mr. Douglas Meurs, sir, your closing words, if you don't mind, for our politicians in this lovely country. We certainly look forward for you to return one day in a more peaceful country that we can prepare.
And before he goes there, we have one of our viewer listeners saying that when Mr. Meurs was here, he took him hunting. Mr. Meurs took the guy, he was a little boy then, took him hunting. So I presume there was a lot of black water at that point in time.
I've swallowed some both on purpose and inadvertently. Thank you very much for your show and for what you do. And for bringing the voices of so many people and so many perspectives to both the Guyanese at home and abroad. And it's been very inspiring to see the Guyanese people come together and safeguard the ballots and make their voices heard and organize themselves. And I hope that this peaceful process of Guyanese themselves solving their own problems will continue. This is very simple. The sanctions are a step that comes about because the current administration in place has failed to recognize the results of an election and move on. Full stop. There's nothing more that needs to be said. Please do your duty, allow the next government to take its place, and open Guyana to business, because the future is very bright for Guyana. And I think we all want to see the Guyanese people move forward in peace and prosperity.
Thank you so much, sir. And I do certainly hope that Guyana can benefit from your economic vision and your experience sometime in the very, very near future. Mr. Douglas Meurs, it's been a pleasure to have you here tonight, sir. A distinct honor for Guyanese to have you in room 592 and to learn. We want to assure you that as a people, we stand supportive of us playing our role in the world of nations. Ms. Misir, it's been a pleasure to have you. And likewise, we want to assure you too that, we welcome you here as often as possible and sooner or later on a permanent basis, hopefully. But to say to you that we certainly hope that, our discussion here tonight can put a lot of people's mind and their unease at a little bit of ease. Ms. Misir and Mr. Meurs, I must, in closing, in appreciating thanks to you both, I must remind viewers and listeners, ladies and gentlemen, we have discussed tonight a plethora, a wide range of things, including we have discussed that the United States has imposed individual sanctions upon persons in Guyana, while there have not been the liberty of disclosing who they are. That might have also been because who knows whether the list is small or it's large or it has the potential of taking people out for adopting good behavior or adding people on for being ridiculous or illegal, sorry. But the potential is there, and there are many reasons why the list is not explicit to the public. That being said, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, these people would learn that they're persona non grata when they board the plane to go there. Then they have to probably come right back. Aside from all of that, Ms. Misir and Mr. Meurs would have educated us as well that those people who are green card holders and those people who hide behind the American veil, they too would do well to stay within the confines of what is acceptable, what is reasonable, and what is good and legal, and not to support an illegality in government that will end up in removing people of their electorate and their right to a vote. So it has been good to have you all here, ladies and gentlemen, as we say thanks once again to Ms. Deborah Misir and Mr. Douglas Meurs. Lady and gentlemen, sir, thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Mahadeo. Thank you, Mr. Leonard.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
And ladies and gentlemen, let me say to you all across Guyana, the Caribbean, and wherever you've joined us from, thank you so much for joining us in room 592. And we certainly look forward to continuing this discussion. Tomorrow at 1:30, we have our usual elections watch under the leadership of Mr. Leonard Gildarie. And tomorrow night, we have Mr. Freddie Kisoon in room 592. So we're looking forward. We're going to keep ourselves educated. We're going to keep the debate going. And we will keep on unleashing the truth in room 592. It's been a pleasure. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, as I tell you every night, say a prayer for this beautiful country of ours. It is still the best place on God-given earth. Stay safe. Be good. Bye-bye now.